Welcome, everyone, to Novel Research, Meet Four Historians of Religion Who Write Fiction. I'm Dr. Sarah Parks from the Department of Religious Studies at St. Francis Xavier University. St. FX resides in Mi'kmaq territory that's governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of the 1700s, which did not cede lands, and yet here we are. It's a privilege for me to act as facilitator today for an exciting discussion among scholars in my field, which is the history of Judaism and Christianity in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, who are somewhat celebrities as far as humanities academics go for their work. Other fields are always mystified at how citations work in the humanities, as opposed to the sciences and social sciences. Our footnotes really are conversations with the work of others, homages, signposts, and to say that each of our panelists is often in my footnotes really says it all. We have with us today Professors Joan Taylor, James McGrath, Zeba Crook, and St. FX's own Matthew Anderson. I'll introduce them now in an abbreviated and somewhat relational way because they all have bibliographies for days. Joan E. Taylor is Professor Emerita of Christian Origins and Second Temple Judaism at King's College London and Honorary Professor of Biblical and Early Christian Studies at the Institute for Religion and Critical Inquiry in Australian Catholic University, Melbourne. She's also area editor for Historical Context and Judean Desert Archaeology for Brill's online encyclopedia of the Dead Sea Scrolls. She's written many groundbreaking monographs, the latest being Boy Jesus, Growing Up Judean in Turbulent Times, 2025. The three of her works I use the most are The Immerser, John the Baptist within Second Temple Judaism, 1997, now out in paperback, and Women Remembered, Jesus' Female Disciples, written together with Helen Bond, and her edited volume with Ilaria Ramelli, Patterns of Women's Leadership in Early Christianity. James F. McGrath is Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Butler University, Indianapolis. He was at the forefront of what's called biblioblogging and blogs on the Patheos platform as Religion Prof. James writes so many books that I have teased him about having clones of himself typing away in the basement. James's books that I interact with the most in my work are his two recent books on John the Baptist that came out simultaneously in 2024, which are John of History, Baptist of Faith, The Quest for the Historical Baptizer, written for academics, and Christmaker, A Life of John the Baptist, geared for lay readers. These stem in part from his work for the critical edition, translation, and commentary of the Mandaean Book of John, 2021. I also enjoy his recent What Jesus Learned from Women, 2022, and his The A to Z of the New Testament, 2023. Zeba Crook is Professor of Religious Studies at Carleton University, Ottawa. Two of his latest books are Religions of a Single God, A Critical Introduction to Monotheisms from Judaism to Baha'i, 2019, and The Ancient Mediterranean Social World, a Source Book, 2020. His book that has shaped my thinking the most is his Reconceptualizing Conversion, Patronage, Loyalty, and Conversion in the Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean, 2004, which I think comes from his PhD dissertation, and his many articles on methodology for historical Jesus work. Matthew R. Anderson is Father Ido Gatto Chair in Christian Studies here at St. Francis Xavier University and Affiliate Assistant Professor at Concordia University, Montreal. His monograph, Prophets of Love, The Unlikely Kinship of Leonard Cohen and the Apostle Paul, 2024, is also connected to his dissertation work on rhetoric in Paul. Two more recent books, which come from his work in decolonizing pilgrimage studies, are Someone Else's Saint, How a Scottish Pilgrimage Led to Nova Scotia, 2025, and The Good Walk, Creating New Paths on Traditional Prairie Trails, 2024. But these accomplishments aren't the main reason why these four are gathered on a panel here today. They're here for something else they all have in common. They are all as committed, talented, and award-winning as teachers and communicators as they are as researcher scholars. And maybe that's why they all have the quirk that brings us here. They also write fiction. Now, I use fiction when I teach ancient history. This term, my Greek and Roman mythology class had a choice between Emily Hauser's For the Most Beautiful and Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad, both retellings of the Iliad, Odyssey, and Trojan War from the perspectives of the women characters. Last term in Apocalypses, my students had to read Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. I do this to help students connect with the material and as a side bonus to get some of them hooked on reading for pleasure. But the scholars here today write fiction. Professor Adele Reinhartz, who couldn't be with us today, is a leading world authority on the Gospel of John, and in her latest book, Cast Out of the Covenant, Jews and Anti-Judaism in the Gospel of John, she writes, quote, I have neither the desire nor the ability to write historical fiction. Where would all the footnotes go? But I'm not above a bit of fictionalizing to aid the historical imagination of myself and my readers. End quote. Reinhartz goes on to create Alexandra, the imagined ideal interlocutor for John. Quote, the compliant audience, a part I cannot play on my own. She's a person who responds wholeheartedly to John's message. She's stirred to faith and called to action. For Adele Reinhartz, fiction became the best way to translate that common historical exercise that Johannine scholars do when they try to understand a writing by reconstructing its imagined audience. This is also what James McGrath does in What Jesus Learned from Women, where he uses fictive letters from the women in Jesus' life to illustrate what we know of ordinary life in first century Judea through feminist historiography and through material culture. Zeba Crook, on the other hand, has made a more committed leap to fiction when, as a New Testament and historical Jesus scholar, he found himself not just folding in some fictional tools to help translate scholarship, but actually writing an entire novel centered on the Jewish war with Rome. It's called Sun's First Shadow, and publishers take note. It doesn't have a home yet. This is similar to Matthew Anderson's current project, funded by the Father Edo Gatto Chairship, called Behind Every Man, Paula and the Ascetic Female Architects of Late Antique Christianity, where he is working on a novel about Paula, the money, and in some cases, maybe the brains, behind the more famous St. Jerome. Publishers take note again. And lastly, Joan Taylor has not just one or two novel manuscripts to her name, but many published novels from all different time periods and settings, including Conversations with Mr. Prain, 2006, Kissing Bowie, 2013, and Napoleon's Willow, A Story of Akaroa, 2016. So, without further ado, let's hear from them about how they came to have their feet in both of these worlds, beginning with our first of two questions today. Question one, how did you come to write fiction as an academic, and what is the fiction you have written? And I've chosen a random order, first James, then Zeba, then Joan, and Matthew for question one.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. Feel honored by what you said about me and feel like I know the other panelists better than I did when we started, which is wonderful. So the answer to the question of how I ended up writing fiction, the short answer is I've sort of always done it for as long as I can remember, but didn't really do anything with it for a very long time and didn't pursue it actively. And the bit of information I need to share prior to the actual direct catalyst is that being at a teaching focused institution, having opportunities to teach outside of my main subject area of New Testament early Christianity, one of the course topics that I quickly gravitated towards was the intersection of religion and science fiction. And teaching on that subject rekindled my my desire to write fiction. Just story ideas would come up as I was thinking about the various topics I was reading in the fiction of others, and thinking, oh, somebody should do this thing that's not quite that, and significantly different enough for that might make for a good story. And occasionally would try writing it. And what actually happened was I put some books here so I can have illustrations. But uh, Paul Levinson, who I'd gotten to know because he does work on science fiction, got in touch with me because he was going to be putting together a collection of essays and short stories about the intersection of religion and spaceflight. And he was expecting me to offer an essay because that is the sort of thing I do. And I saw this opportunity and said, would you be willing to consider a short story? And from there, it has sort of spiraled. But I've done a fair bit of science fiction and really enjoy exploring that. It gives so much room for thought experiments. They're not always entirely unrelated to the Bible. My most recent short story is called "The Truth Was Out There." It was published in a an anthology just last year. And the way it starts is just as a teaser for anyone who might be interested. If anyone asks you why the second coming hasn't happened yet, direct them to classified file 739SX27. But I've also found myself writing historical fiction, and sometimes things that are, might even be categorized as biblical alternative history. And some of that happened in What Jesus Learned from Women. And I'll talk more about that because that's the one that really, I think, gets at how this intersects with the actual academic work that I do. But one of the stories that I published came about because somebody asked a question on my blog. And they asked this question that really was something I would never have occurred to me. They asked, has anybody explored the possibility that maybe the three, or not the three, but the Magi, the wise men from Matthew's infancy story, might be real, but they were sent by the king of Parthia to stir up trouble by asking whether there was a newborn king around. And my reaction was, I don't think anybody's explored that. And I'm not sure that there's any reason to explore it sort of in an academic essay. But oh gosh, somebody needs to tell that story. And so that led to a story that I gave the title, We Three Spies of Parthia Are. And so, and I mean, to be honest, it's fun. I think we can take these things much too seriously, and particularly when it comes to religion, people often um, lose their sense of humor that they might otherwise have. And so I think that having fun with these things that we're also interested in academically um, just makes for a more well-rounded sort of engagement. But anyway, that's the story of how I ended up writing some of the things that I've written, including the catalyst that really got it started all in terms of publishing.
Thank you. James, can you also tell us about academfic? I forgot to mention
Ah,
it in my
yes.
intro.
Yeah. Thank you for that prompting. So one of the things that uh, sometimes proves to be the case when academics who are not in creative writing write fiction is that sometimes the things we write are a bit more like, philosophical thought experiments, or, they might be historical fiction, but getting into a lot more detail than the average reader wants to read because we're really interested in these things as hopefully engaging in a literary way, but also being pedagogically useful for people to teach with, people to explore, to really sink their teeth into the details of a time and place. And that's not always the kind of thing that publishers want and that literary journals are looking for. And so created a periodical, and it's an open access periodical, and it's for academics who are in fields other than creative writing who write fiction. And so we've had philosophers and anthropologists and historians and various other people contribute, and yeah, a number of scientists, and have just enjoyed being part of that, and was really struck because one of the things that really brought home to me was just how many of us there are who do this thing, not because we are in any way obligated to professionally, But and sometimes so I know some people who do it under a pen name, a pseudonym, because they're worried that this might detract from their serious scholarly reputation. But there are a lot of us who do it. And that gave a sense, even though I don't regularly stay in touch with all the authors who submit to Academic, gave a sense that there is a community for us. We are part of a larger group. And it sometimes feels lonely when you do this thing and don't realize that there are others also doing it as well.
Thank you. Seba Crook, how did this happen for you?
When I was just starting at Carleton, I lived in Ottawa while my wife lived in London, Ontario. We both had different jobs at different universities, and I subletted my apartment for the summer so I could return to London. That was our home base. And my apartment here was a bachelor apartment with a bed, a table, and a bookshelf. It was pretty spare because it wasn't home. And I came back in September and everything was in place, but somehow I noticed there was one book on my bookshelf which wasn't there when I left. And I took it down, it was called Testament. I was like, this sounds vaguely religious studies-y, Christian origins-y. And I opened it up and realized immediately that it was fictional. I didn't know the name of the author on the front of it. It was Nino Ricci. I should have known, but I didn't. And so I started reading it and realized that it was amazing, and then realized that it was a historical novel about Jesus. And I loved it. And that got me thinking along academic lines, could there be any others? Um, Only to realize there are thousands of historical Jesus fiction. So then that got me started on thinking about Jesus novels from an academic historical perspective. So I didn't even realize it was an option to keep writing Jesus fiction after the gospel writers had done it. Uh, and then so that was step one. Step two was returning to Vancouver, where I spent my very formative 20s for a CSBS. And it was the weirdest thing. Hate to get all spiritual on you, but um, touchdown, the wheels touch the tarmac, and this line enters my head, the first line of a novel. And I was kind of like blown away. It's like, oh my God. And I knew what it was, and I knew that I had to write it. And I actually spent that entire Congress, other than my session, in my room writing, starting this novel. That was a really long time ago because I don't even remember when Congress was at UBC. It was a super long time ago. Um, so I wrote this thing, and I'm not an avid reader of fiction or historical fiction. So I wrote this thing and it was terrible. Um, I sent it to a friend of a friend who is a CanLit professor, um, and her critique, which was fair and reasonable, was using language I didn't even understand. So I didn't know how to fix the problems if I didn't even understand the language she was describing the problems. So I realized I needed to learn how to write fiction. So I started reading about writing fiction. And then I took a course at Humber in my sabbatical. I did a creative writing session with Nino Ricci. And that was transformative. Um, and that made me realize that I didn't want my novel to be about the Jewish war. I wanted my novel to be about a family and what living in the Jewish war would do to a family. Um, and that really transformed my story. Um, and got rid of that stuff that James was referring to, that dump of data that I had access to as an academic that only I and probably a few very male readers would find interesting. It's a novel about a war, um, and soldiers are awesome. And so, all my 12-year-old friends and nephews would love it, but I realized that it actually wasn't the story that I wanted to tell. Um, and so that's how the novel came to be about a family, and not about a war.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah. And so in the meantime, of not having this published, I've also realized that I have other stories to tell. And so I have been, I've had two short stories published in literary journals. that are semi-autobiographical in nature. So they're about me, they're about my life, but they're not they're creative nonfiction. Um, and so I have been honing my skills at writing, so that one day when I grow up, I can be like Joan Taylor. That's my life dream. Uh, I want to be like Joan. Um, and so I've been working on that in a variety of other genres, but working on my creative writing abilities, um, and seeing what I can do with the novel.
Wow, well, that is a perfect segue to hear how Joan Taylor came to write novels. Joan is on the other side of the world.
Thank you. I having problem with my internet, so oh, sorry. I might talk on top of other people because you're keeping on cutting out for me. Sarah suddenly has disappeared as well from my screen. So really sorry if I'm not kind of clicking in with the group. Um, Thank you so much for having me today. I'm completely different in terms of how I started off writing creative fiction because I started off writing creative fiction before I went into the academic study of ancient Christianity and Judaism. And I was brought into academic study because I was determined to write a novel about Jesus. And I was in my early 20s and I wrote this novel, which, totally understand, Zeba. It was terrible, but I was really, really involved with all of the historical background reading, and I loved researching about it and finding out about the real story of Jesus. And so I had an agent at that time who was working with another novel that I had written, which was much more appropriate for my age, a sort of, you know, novel about someone in their 20s. Um, and uh, and I gave it to him and he went, what is this? You are age 23 and you have written a novel about Jesus. No one is going to take this seriously because, of who you are. You can say you've done a lot of background reading, but, what are you trying to do? And I actually put in a lot of the interesting historical stuff that I had learnt about. And I kind of had the fictional bit, and then I would do these little bits where it was just historical because I was so fascinated by the history, and then I would jump back to the fiction. And he said, "Well, what are you trying to do even? You're trying to write a fictional story, but you're also putting in these historical things." So I thought, well, by golly, drat, I am going to learn about history and I'm going to come back to this novel and I'm going to make it great. Um, and so I then enrolled in postgraduate studies because my first degree was in English literature because that was what was going to help me with my fiction. And then I did postgraduate work in history and archaeology of the ancient world of the beginnings of the church. And I got completely hooked on the study, the academic study. So I then went into academia and I left my terrible novel on one side. And as time has gone on, I have tried to keep the creative side still alive. I had a career break for family reasons. But while I was on my career break, I went right back to writing fiction. And that's where the two novels have come from, the Napoleon's Willow. Well, first of all, I had that original novel that I wrote that was with the agent in London, Conversations with Mr. Prain, went all around the houses and then finally came out in New York with Melville House. And then in that career break, I went into a completely different side of history, New Zealand history, and wrote Napoleon's Willow, and also this other sort of strangely memoir-like book, Kissing Bowie, which was based on some diaries I had in London in the early 1980s. And and that was really great for me to get back into creativity and back into those novels. But the Jesus novel is still sitting there. And I actually, a few years ago, dug it out and I thought maybe I could do something with this. And started to rewrite it. And I got through the first part of it up to when John the Baptist arrives. And then, actually, because I've written about John the Baptist, James will know about this, I kind of got stuck. And there is this whole problem of too much information we want to put down. And Zeba, it's absolutely the case. We have to think about the characters, what are you actually doing with a novel? You're telling a story about people and their experience, and you involve the reader by them identifying with the people whose story you're telling. So regardless of all of the stuff that we know, we've got to kind of get our way through it, really. And so I then stopped. I did try sending it to that first part to a couple of publishers, and they were publishers of my academic work, and they kind of went, "What are you doing?" No, we don't really know what to do with this, and it's difficult because it's not faith fiction. There's a whole world of faith fiction, but my novels were more, yeah, they're not of that ilk. My novel on Jesus is not quite of that ilk. It's historical fiction, just straight historical fiction. Yeah, so I don't know what to do with it at the moment. I've rewritten this first bit of it. It's my lifetime piece of writing that has gone through different versions already, and there we are. But I'm fine with writing other kinds of fiction. I don't have the problems that I have with writing this Jesus novel.
So publishers take note again. There's another manuscript here. Thank you, Joan. And last but not least, Matthew Anderson. How did you come to this?
Well, I'll say something about that, but I wanted to say also, probably on my behalf, but also on behalf of the other panelists, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for moderating. And I just, in case that wasn't said anywhere else, I wanted to say thank you. Thanks for taking that role on for this. And also thanks to the other panelists, because the reason we're gathering it is in part because of this Father Ido Gatto chair that I'm holding, and the fact that the output for this Gatto is supposed to be a novel and an historical novel. So that comes back to how did I start writing? I'm a little bit somewhere in between maybe the stories that have already been told, because I also wrote fiction before I like quite separately from my academic stuff. There was fiction. But also in my case, because I am well, I guess I still am, you never get rid of it. I'm an ordained Lutheran minister. I haven't practiced as a Lutheran clergyman for some clergy person for some time, but I put in 10,000 hours of sermons, let's say. And then all that kind of writing that I did in sermons, at some point I thought, I'd like to write some other things. And I wrote a short story for a CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation contest, and it turns out I won. And so then they published it, and I thought, I like this. And I wound up writing other short stories. And so I have 8 published short stories in sort of like Zeb, I guess, in the sense that they're in writing journals. And in my case, they're either in anthologies or in journals, but they are all there only because of a contest, of some sort of a contest or other. So I didn't have to deal so much with soliciting a publisher at that point, but neither did I have a work that was specifically mine. And then I went on to trying to do other kinds of writing. So I wrote a radio drama. And that was some years ago. I'm kind of embarrassed to hear it now, but it was wonderfully exciting to hear it on the radio, on the national radio here in Canada. And I always wanted to attempt a novel. I finally did attempt a novel, and I got some Canada Council Prize grants for that. And I finished the novel, and then hit the problem of a publisher. Because while I got the Canada Council grants, I submitted the novel, and I got sometimes some very nice rejection letters, but they were rejection letters. And that, anyway, well, so there's a novel that's languishing. And it has won high praise from critics and absolutely no publishing contract so far. And that's I hear that as a theme in what we're talking about. There's this thing about publishing, and of course I've experienced that too. So I love writing fiction. I just love doing it on the I love doing it on the side, but it has this Father Edo Gatto has become a way for me to incorporate it and to fold it more precisely into my academic work, and especially with this character of Paula. And I'm very interested. Paula's a little bit like the far side of the moon in the sense that Jerome is always in our, if you're looking at the spirit of time, Jerome's always in your face. You know, Jerome puts himself in your face all the time. And Jerome is just such a scoundrel that it's hard to avoid Jerome. And yet when you're looking at it, you're kind of going, wait a minute, Paula, she's the one with the money. Arguably, she was, according to, I mean, the only evidence, almost the only evidence we have for Paula is Jerome, and he's notoriously unreliable and sort of self-serving. And yet even he, if we kind of read against the grain, is saying things that seem to indicate all of the incredible attributes that Paula had, plus the influence, plus the money, plus the status, and probably then plus the influence. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful? James has gone a long ways down this path of how do you recover, especially ancient women's history, biblical women's history, but then how do you recover other history when you have, and Sarah, you've done work on this too, by the way, and I want to point that out, a lot of work on this, but how do you recover the history of people who have been marginalized in the sources? And Paula is a great example of this. And so I've taken that on as a task, and I'm really, really pleased I've been taking notes as James and Zeb and John have been talking, and I'm really excited to continue in the conversation. But my own writing, in some ways, has been separate from my fiction, and I'm only or from my academic work, and I'm kind of bringing it together now is really what's happening. And I'm excited to be learning from others. So that's me.
Well, that's a perfect transition into question two of our two-question panel today. Thank you all so much. The second question is about pedagogy, history, and fiction, and how they mingle together. So, everyone, for you, what are some of the gains, pitfalls, and pedagogical strategies when it comes to communicating our knowledge of history through imagined characters and narratives? And I'll go in reverse order this time: Matthew, Joan, then Zeba, and James.
All right, so I guess I keep talking. I learned something already about this. I was listening to both Zeb and John were talking a little, especially at the end, John, we're talking about the issue of exposition a little bit. I don't think you use that word exposition, but the idea of what's the opposite of character and plot-driven narrative, say. Well, actually, James, you made mention of that too when you were talking about the academic and the reason why there would be a niche thing going on there. I did something. I gave a talk. You probably can't see that, no, because I've got the blur on. Well, imagine a four-part quadrant. You've got an X and you've got four quadrants. And imagine one of them is plot, one of them is setting, one of them is goal, sort of authorial goal, and the other is character. So plot, setting, goal, maybe pedagogical or authorial goal, and character. in each one of the four quadrants. I think for those of us, for us academics, in some ways, setting is the easiest. I mean, it's the most, well, not easiest, but it's the path that we're most familiar with. At least I am. Like I started doing research, and in fact, I've been using Joan's work for my research. Uh, uh, Several of your work. There's the Duo a Duo article, which is a fabulous article. That's not the title, but the 2x2 article one. But mostly I'm not sure if it was your first book and based on your thesis, but the one about pilgrimage, essentially, about ancient places in the Holy Land and the Christianization of places in the Holy Land. And I've certainly been using that. And so I love this research. I dig into it. And so setting is the funnest thing for me. I mean, that's it. You know, I can dig into this. What kind of houseplants were there? I just finished reading Zeb's wonderful novel. And I was looking at it going, okay, so were they eating that in the first century in Palestine, or what were they eating? And like wine, you know, there's a famous Roman wine, I've forgotten the name of it, in the fourth century that they talk about in the Roman Empire, this sort of wine that the elites would have had. I mean, not that Paula and Jerome necessarily would have drunk it, but other elite Romans. And then I'm thinking about it and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, but this is now the Holy Land. This is Bethlehem, and they wouldn't have had necessarily wine from from the peninsula. They would have been drinking wine from Gaza, actually, which was shipping out wine in the fourth century and was quite well known for its vineyards. And so that kind of setting it's wonderful, and I get lost in that, in all of that, and I go, wait a minute, there's plot, there's character, you know, and I have to get to all of that. So the question of what are the gains and pitfalls, I think as an academic, even though I did start writing fiction before some of the other stuff, I'm still an academic, and I tend to get caught in the research. And I would say for me, particularly in dealing with Jerome and Paula, once you start reading Jerome's letters, it's hard not to get sucked in by his rhetoric. And he's just such a sweet speaker, you know, you have to kind of avoid that. So those are some of the pitfalls that I've had to deal with. You really have to work to come back to the plot and to focus on the characters, which has already been mentioned, but that is the issue that I've been facing.
And Joan?
I'll try not to cut you off this time, Sarah. Yeah, it's absolutely the same issue as I said before. It is the setting draws you in. I think actually, if you've got this creative mind and we go into this material, it makes us ask different questions of the past. And what you say about what you said about going against the grain before is absolutely what we can offer, really, when we think creatively about our materials. Because we're not just looking at the surface of the text, we're going, okay, let's think of the whole world this text belongs to. Let's look at what this person was in that world, what kind of people they are addressing, what was their world, yeah, what wine were they drinking, what were they eating, what were their everyday concerns, broadening out anything that we look at. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, actually, it was a technique of hers to think creatively about the past and think beyond the text. That was a way of going against the grain. So she encouraged her students to do this exercise of creative imagination, not with an idea of getting something published, but just as a way of breaking free from the dominant voices of the text, and also their interpreters, the mainstream interpreters, as she called them. I sat in on her classes when I was at Harvard for a year doing, I was there for as a research associate teaching my own module. And I was able to sit on her classes, which was fantastic in the 1990s. And I just think that way of thinking, the creative way of thinking, we could use more in anything that we teach to get our students to um, think beyond what we're handed down from the past, which is very curated in terms of what gets remembered, whether it's for theological reasons or for just the reasons of utility, or, or whatever whoever is in control thinks is important at any given time gets copied over the centuries and then gets passed down to. So we can look at bits and pieces that maybe are not so central and go, okay, I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look at that character, and it's going to, and I'm then going to turn everything around. So I look at the same story that's been told by those dominant voices, but from the perspective of that character. And it's going to open up this world that I'm going to research as well as anybody else. And I'm going to show you something completely different from their perspective. So the creative voice really plays a part in terms of our understanding of the past. Historical fiction of whatever kind it is, plays that role, and people love it because of that, really. We're not just reading the dominant voices.
Yes, thank you for that. There have been a number of feminist historians like Elizabeth Schuster-Franza, Bernadette Bruton, Adele Reinhartz, so many people who have talked about imagination as a historical method that's necessary for learning the history of enslaved people, women, any marginalized character, even just followers of Jesus that aren't named for our time period. Imagination is necessary in those cases. Uh, and so that leaves just James. Pitfalls, gains. Oh no, am I wrong? Zeba. Zeba and James.
Um, so after I discovered this Nino Ricci novel in my little apartment, um, so I had been teaching historical Jesus course at a third year level at Carleton every year or every second year. And every time I did it, I chose a different textbook because I'd get to the end of the course thinking that textbook was awful. Not that it was there were problems for scholarship, but that it's just so dense and the students weren't attracted to it. That it wasn't engaging. Um, and so I actually assigned Nino Ricci's Testament as the textbook and decided that any theory that they needed, they could get from the lectures instead of from the dense textbook. Um, the idea being that they would probably read the entirety page to page, where that was never going to happen with a textbook. And so sure enough, they're reading it page to page and they're more engaged with it. They're drawn into the story. And so I felt that that was a much better way of delivering context to them than through a textbook. Then last year, or last term, I did a fourth year seminar and I framed it as a historiography course on religious founder narratives. Um, and so I was asking them to think about founder narratives and how we know about the past, so historiography. Um, and and their job was to write a short story, taking a founder figure and narrativizing it. And so doing the research necessary into that person, what they accomplished, into their world, so that they could create a world that would draw the reader in and tell a story about this person. Um, and so, very much in the spirit of what you cited from Adele at the beginning, that getting them to think actually along the lines also of Hayden White that writing history is a creative act. Even as a scholar, we are making up a whole lot of stuff, and we don't like to admit it. And we like to think we're doing so responsibly, That is, we're hemmed in by some sense of scholarly responsibility. So we're not bringing Martians into things where they don't belong, but barring that, we're still making up a lot of stuff. And so, getting the students to really engage with that question of how creative is academic historical writing? How different is it really from creative writing historical writing? Um, and to even to get them so many times we would return to this question where they're just like, sorry, what's the difference again? Because we had so much trouble actually making a firm line between what is historical fiction and what is historical writing. Um, so really just getting them to seriously engage with how blurry that boundary is between them.
Amazing. And that leaves us with James.
Yeah. And I felt like everyone was looking at me when Zeppa mentioned bringing in Martians where they don't belong, uh, have been known for that sort of thing. I hope I haven't brought them in where they don't belong, but I have been known to bring them in. But yeah, as somebody who does sci-fi things and also does historical fiction things, I have, I think, largely kept them separate. The one example where I did not, and they really do intersect, is in a story that was inspired again by a conversation on my blog that then became something that I would use as a thought experiment in my classes. Had a conversation with an atheist who gathered that I was still some sort of Christian and couldn't make sense of that since I seemed rational. And so gave me this thought experiment that he thought would uh, get me to rethink my, uh, my, or at least acknowledge that I was misguided and believing things without evidence. And so said, basically, you can have a TARDIS, right, a time and space machine, and go anytime, any place. What could you, in theory, see that would cause you to lose your faith? And I found that to be a really useful thought experiment and used it with others. But as I thought about it, right, one place that came into mind was, of course, uh, vicinity of Jerusalem, maybe just go straight to the Church of Holy Sepulchre, the odds are at least somewhat stronger than other locations, and see if anything interesting happens, and tried to imagine what might one see there, and to try to actually narrate it, not just leave it as a thought experiment, if I saw this, if I saw that, but what might happen. But the main place where I've done the historical fiction and tried to use it pedagogically was in What Jesus Learned from Women, and started each chapter with either a letter or a bit of something that's almost like an interview with these women. I sought a lot of feedback and input on those because I knew that as a male author I could do a very poor job of that and get myself into serious trouble. It was questionable enough that as a male author writing a book titled What Jesus Learned from Women. But the issues that have been brought up were really central to my own concern, which is that on the one hand, there are a lot of historians, mostly male, throughout history who've said, well, we'd love to write about the women and the enslaved people and this and that, but the sources don't give us enough to go on. Meanwhile, we're using our imaginations quite freely to fill in the gaps in relation to all these male characters who get our attention. And so didn't want to do that. And also didn't want to contribute to this thing that I encountered as I was putting the bibliography together for this book and doing all this reading, was that there were so many insights in publications by women, and there was such a huge volume of scholarship from women on the female characters, comparatively more than from male scholars, and yet often their important insights were not to be found in the work of male scholars. And so wanted to be a male scholar writing about the women and to say this is not just something that women do, because as Sarah wonderfully puts it in one of her publications, there aren't just things you miss about women when you don't ask about the women, right? There are things you miss about the whole scenario and about the male characters like Jesus that you might be first and foremost interested in. And so those bits of historical fiction, I think there's a place for these. I think of the kinds of things that just have that little bit more, a little bit, I'll dare say too much detail compared to what you would want if this were fiction that you're reading sort of entirely for pleasure. I tried to make them interesting and enjoyable, but they had a sort of a pedagogical aim here, and I think there's a place for that as well. And as I did this, hoping that at least that part would be interesting for a general audience, even if some of the very detailed stuff that followed was not. What I found that really surprised me, and I've tried to figure out how to incorporate this, sort of going forward, is that seeking to narratize, seeking to tell the story of the characters actually is an astonishingly rigorous and quite severe form of evaluation of a historical reconstruction. There were several instances where I was trying to tell the story and it was not working well. I could not put sort of plausible dialogue on the lips of characters. And I realized what that's telling me is that there's something missing. I need to go back to the evidence and think more about this. Or some of my assumptions about what's motivating a character here is wrong, or about what's going on. And so not only do I think that this can be useful for conveying the results of our scholarship, but I really do think that attempting to write the fiction, acknowledging that in between the actual data points in our ancient sources, we are filling in things. But if we can't come up with a plausible way of telling the story in the way we have connected the dots in our minds, that should drive us to revisit the connections that we're making and our historical reconstructions. And so not only do I hope to continue doing this as part of research and not just for communicating the results of the research, but I strongly encourage others to try it as well.
Wow, thanks so much. To my delight, and I'm sure the audience's delight, we actually have some time for a taste of the goods. Everyone, as far as I know, everyone has graciously agreed to share one or more readings. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I've changed the order again. We can begin with Joan, then James, Matthew, and finally Zeba. So let us know what are you going to read and why, and do it with feeling.
Okay, well, I thought, okay, I will go back to my Jesus novel, the never-ending Jesus novel. And I opened it up a few days ago and I thought, okay, what can I read from this? And um, I think I probably should just read the very, very first few couple of pages. So it gets you into the background of the sort of framework of why there is this novel at all in terms of the world that I'm creating. So the novel is now actually, as I said, I've redone the first part. A few years ago, I redid this first part. So it's not the novel as I wrote in my 20s. It is quite a different novel. And I really don't know what to do with it. But let me begin. It's called Jesus and Satan. That is the novel's title now. And yes, I'm very interested in the dualities of Jesus' message. And I'm really trying to put that theme through in terms of the characters that I'm exploring, who are all coming from a place where they are very, very alienated from society. Anyway, let me begin. Prelude, a dialogue in Pergamum, AD 94. Oh, please let me write it down, grandmother, or it will be lost forever. As I keep saying, Lois, I am too old. All this happened too long ago. That world has gone, and no one cares about our Lord as he really was any more than they care about the city that was Jerusalem. Just look at what our friend Apelles has written. Now Jesus is a god to the Egyptians, or he's a philosopher to the Greeks, and what he said has been turned either into divine oracles or wise sayings for discussion while strolling in pleasant gardens. All the more reason to write it, grandmother, or they will keep on reciting these things. People will believe anything. But my dear girl, you know that I am not a historian or a writer of biographies. I am a storyteller. People buy my novels, people love my romances, and no one would expect me to write the truth. No one trusts the memories of an old woman anyway. No one tells stories like you. Our brothers and sisters will say I'm telling tales and misleading them. No, grandmother, it is true that they do not value your art, but they value your memories. They cherished what you said about the dripping water in the cave in Gethsemane that night and how cold it was. They do not value my art, indeed. They value tent making, weaving, and making glass, or any other kind of craft, but not writing novels. Everyone has to make a living somehow, or we wouldn't be able to share it with the poor for the sake of the kingdom. You are a fine crafter, grandmother. How else could I afford all these books? But your novels end in marriage, and Marcellus says no one should marry in the present age. Ah, Marcellus has his holy path of renunciation to better the Cynics and the Stoics. I understand he now only eats bread and hyssop, like those people in Alexandria. As I told him, the Lord did not condemn romance or marriage, or indeed food. He wanted his apostles to live like angels, but only so as to set up an impossible standard for everybody else. I think it was his way of teasing, to jog us into forgiving each other. Then the idiots think he has set a mark for us all to jump to and reach, the very thing he spurned. He only really cared about compassion and mercy. No one understands how much he teased. He'd say things with a smile, with a twinkle in his eye. He made fun of anyone self-righteous and pompous, right to their faces. His humor is lost in the translation of those teachings Matthew threw together before he died, and it's gone completely in Mark's bundle of what Peter said. So you write about it. I'd rather write it as an allegory, like John. But no, it's impossible to tell of Jesus except through the eyes of those who knew him. Ah, well. Oh, don't look at me like that. Perhaps as a storyteller, I could inhabit those eyes. Yes, yes, please tell it as a novel, grandmother, just as you write anything else. You speak it, and I will copy it down. Tell the stories of the people you knew and what they told you, and present them as you want. Leave the rest to me. Well, I could tell a story about the other Jesus, the one they called Barabbas, and Joanna in the house of Antipas, and about Mariam and Clemens, because that was a strange romance if ever there was. Yes, yes, write about everyone you knew when you were young. I can tell the history for those that don't know. If you narrate oh, I could tell the history a little too, I suppose. I wish you would. Ah, but no, no. We will not only be dismissed by our brothers and sisters as telling lies, we will both die in the arena for telling the truth. Death, of course, I myself do not fear at my age, but the manners of death now devised for the crowd's entertainment are not for you, my sweet girl. They will call you a sorceress. Grandmother, I have been prepared for any suffering ever since hearing of Thecla. Oh dear, but I cannot stand the thought of you in the arena no matter what you say. Please don't pull that face. So you would be silent to protect me? Isn't fear an instrument of Satan? You said that. They terrorize us into silence. Oh, don't. You're talking about a novel. Don't be gagged to protect me, grandmother, or I will write it all down myself in my own name, everything you've told me already, and I'll go out and read it aloud in the market. I will, Lois, stop that right now. You'll do no such thing. Oh, please, take yourself back to the days in Judea, just like you did over dinner last night. Speak and let me write down the stories of the people you knew. Your work will be anonymous. We can have it copied by the hand of the deaf and dumb slave, Rubia. We can keep our identities secret. Everyone will know it was me, but perhaps you would be spared. Please, grandmother. Oh, Lois, Lois, what can I do? I am too old to fight you in this arena. Let it be as you want. Let me go to the latrine again. These days it takes me an age. Ask Melian for some date wine, cheese, and olives out here under the tree. Bring the ink and styly on my table, and the cloth. There's a roll of good paper in the cupboard next to the door in my room with the Ctesias there. Start with that. As you wish. Let's put the devil to the test. That's where the prelude finishes. Thank you.
Well, I want to read the novel after that, that's for sure. Thank you so much. James, what did you bring to read?
Well, I've been trying to decide which bit to go with, and had found one that was just short enough that I thought it would work, but just really want to read part of one of the other bits. And so this is from, it's not the complete bit of historical fiction that introduces the chapter about the Syrophoenician woman. And so there's a bit of background about how this particular woman in who the Syrophoenician woman knows this Jewish woman, Deborah, who has this connection with Jesus. We often don't ask about, like, so who did Jesus stay with when he was there? You know, and these kinds of questions that often only occur to us when we start trying to tell the story. And then how would this local woman know that Jesus was there if Jesus has not been there previously and has not, you know, and so what are the connections at work? And so this happens in the house of somebody who has become a supporter of the Jesus movement, who lives in the vicinity of Tyre. And I'll pick it up, hopefully at a place that will get me through this quickly. So the Syrophoenician woman is narrating, I said nothing to anyone, but the more I thought about the prospect of Jesus coming here, the more I thought that it was meant to be. I had contemplated going to seek him out myself for my daughter's sake, and now he was coming here. The gods must surely be bringing him here for a reason, I thought. And it was never a problem for me to stop by at Deborah's unannounced. I would go to him, beseech him to help my daughter. Perhaps he would come and put his hands on Astraea's eyes and make her well, or perhaps his wisdom was such that he would recommend some treatment I could go home and try. I couldn't bring her there and risk having him refuse to see us, or say or do something that would add insult to her injury. It turned out I was right to be worried about this. When I got to Deborah's home, Jesus was there in the main courtyard, and so I saw him before he had a chance to avoid meeting the surprise guest. He didn't look majestic or noble, powerful or spiritual, as his reputation would lead you to expect. He looked exhausted. What Deborah had said about how the increasingly large crowds of people with illnesses pleading for his help were taking their toll on him ought to have prepared me. But when someone has an impressive reputation, seeing them tired is always going to be a disappointment compared with one's expectations. But I wasn't going to be deterred if there was any chance my daughter might be made well. Seizing the opportunity, I did what I had only seen my maidservants do when they had ruined my clothing or made some other blunder that meant they deserved a beating. I threw myself on the ground before him and began to wail and plead for him to show mercy towards my daughter. Surely just as I usually gave in to such pleading, so this Jesus would as well. I was wrong. He looked at me and sighed. At first I thought he might not say anything at all. But when he spoke, I wished in that moment that he had indeed chosen to remain silent. What he said pierced my soul with a cold shiver. He said, as if not even speaking to me, but mainly to Deborah and anyone else who might be listening, that it wasn't appropriate to take the bread from children and give it to dogs. Deborah gasped. Jesus looked at her with surprise, then back at me. I was furious and turned to leave. Deborah's face was filled with apology and sorrow as I turned in her direction. But after a couple of steps, I stopped and turned around. I wasn't going to let that man have the last word. I looked him in the eye and said that where I come from, even dogs get a chance to eat the scraps that fall from the table where the children are eating. I know how Jews feel about our love for dogs here in Phoenicia. He had been making fun of my people and insulting me personally all at once. I had heard about his clever way with words and was glad I repaid him in equal measure, even though I'd still have to go home bitterly disappointed. Not only with Jesus, but also with Deborah for associating with him. I was also angry at myself for getting my hopes up as I had. I was glad I hadn't told Estrella why I was paying a visit to Deborah today, so perhaps she might never hear about this incident. At least when I left, I could know that I'd turned his air of superiority towards Phoenicians back on him. They think they're superior for not wasting food on dogs. Our dogs eat what is left after we have been satisfied. And to deliberately starve a dog when the children have been filled and are satisfied wasn't merely wasteful, it was cruel. I walked towards the doorway, but before I reached the exit from the courtyard, I heard a sound. I slowed, then stopped, even as everything in me wanted to leave there as quickly as possible. It sounded like laughter. I spun around, thinking that Jesus was mocking me as I departed, like the dog he considered me to be, leaving with my tail between my legs. I thought I was already furious, but in that moment I became angrier still, angrier than I ever remember being. But when I spun around and looked at him, something stopped me from saying the things that had been rushing through my mind. He didn't look as though he were mocking or spiteful. He didn't look angry. It took a moment till I could figure out what the way he was laughing and looking at me conveyed. But then it hit me. He looked like he was impressed, and that disarmed me. Before I could find some other words to say, he spoke and said, "For that answer, go, knowing your daughter is healed." I didn't know what to say. Deborah had told me this man sometimes healed with just a word, but I didn't honestly believe it. Was that to be it? He'd just tell me to go, she's healed, and I'd go home and find her well? I hesitated, then gave an acknowledging nod and left. I couldn't smile or thank him after what he had said to me. I wasn't even sure I believed what he'd said at the end. I'd find out soon enough.
Wonderful. Matthew, what have you chosen to read?
I have it's really a rough draft from the historical novel about Paula and Jerome, and it's an encounter with the local governor. So I'll just start. But again, it's a rough draft. The governor bowed to receive Paula's blessing, then knelt before Jerome. Dipped, rather, Paula observed, the younger man's knees barely touching the decorated tiles where penitent or troublesome brothers might wait an hour for Jerome to raise them. No matter. Jerome blessed the man, and they took their places on the dining couches. The governor's conversation was unornamented, short sentences to the point. His hair was trimmed tightly to his scalp. Despite his office and the dinner invitation, there was none of the oiled coif or the lightly painted lips of the city. He was clearly a military man, here neither for pleasure nor spiritual help. Palestina Prima was a large territory. There had been talk that Rome wanted to subdivide it. Practically, this would be a demotion the governor would want to avoid. He spoke primarily to Jerome, but he sat on his stool so that his body remained oriented also toward Paula, and his eyes kept darting toward her. She was the unacknowledged center, the pivot. Despite knowing this, she said little while she listened intently to the men. Both frequently paused in their back and forth, presumably to leave space for her commentary should she wish to interject. She did not. Rank has privileges, but it is not a suit of clothing one can easily leave behind. If she sometimes forgot her senatorial family in this new life, at the outskirts of Rome's reach, men such as the governor reminded her they couldn't help themselves. Paula had told the kitchen slaves to spare no expense at market, and they had clearly enjoyed the unusual license. The locals might not know Rome's or Constantinople's fine cuisines. On the other hand, the palette of spices and sauces available even in Bethlehem made especially Rome's look pale. After a course of fruits and honey, they were served pigeons stuffed with dried fig and pistachio. Jerome smiled at the odors and even lifted one plate to his nose as a sign of appreciation to the staff, but he barely ate. Paula saw that the governor likewise partook extremely lightly, As was usual for her, midweek, she had nothing but water. The staff would dine well tonight on the self-disciplined leftovers of these three, two for God, one for empire. The governor spoke of bandits and of the influx of Arab and Ethiopian traders who were no longer content to act as middlemen to the Roman spice traffic, but increasingly asserting their presence in the trade. Jerome laughed lightly as the final plate was removed untouched by any of them. A fat paunch never breeds fine thought, he said, using Greek for the traditional proverb. We will all think well tonight. The governor was an Easterner. No doubt he was well acquainted with the saying, but instead of answering in Greek, the man replied with another saying from the West. Although his mouth curved awkwardly around the Latin, he spoke with a smile. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. Greasy fingers slip from the sword. Or too easily from the cross, Paula interrupted. She had no desire to offend a man who had already been of some use in their settling into Bethlehem, but neither did she have patience for any ostentatious displays of learning, which she could tell both men would enjoy, nor, God forbid, for a verbal cockfight, given the slight suspicion always coloring interactions between soldiers and priests, and Jerome's inevitable tetchiness. She reached out, dipping her fingers into the flowered water. The soldier of Christ, she stated, looking straight at the governor, marches on through all reports. Sir, might as well say it, we have suffered a most tragic murder. Forgive my rudeness, but be assured it betrays only the strong currents of my honest emotions. We have been attacked, and we believe you may be able to help us. There. The governor finally returned her look directly. His eyes were hooded and his expression guarded. Yes, he said finally after a long pause. I've been informed of your problem. That's that.
And thank you. Our final reading is from Zeba.
Okay, well, I don't know what I did to have to follow this. Like, this is not fair. Listening to Joan, I felt like I was listening to an accomplished audiobook. James, I adored how you made a familiar story and made it unfamiliar with tone and emotion. That was beautiful. And I didn't know Matthew was writing a detective not mystery, and now I am a page turner. So I don't belong here. Um, so where I'm going to read from, it's in the Jewish War. The war is just over 3 years old, and Jerusalem is caught in a civil war between three figures claiming to be the Messiah. But one of them, Shimon bar Giora, has the upper hand at this point in the story. He thinks he has Eleazar, another of the Messiahs, and his army trapped in the temple and the city sealed off. Nobody's allowed in or out, lest some of the people coming in or out are enemy soldiers coming in or leaving for equipment. Citizens are therefore unable to escape. The Romans have not yet arrived. Mattathias is the narrator of this story. He is the youngest son of my family, and he's walking in the city at night. As I turned to walk toward the northernmost city gate, I turned to walk toward the northernmost city gate, not that I was planning to pass through it. I squatted down gingerly to dig a small stone from my sandal. Something caused me to look up. Had something moved ahead of me? The movement of whatever I saw was fluid and subtle. I doubted my own eyes. I looked again, searching for a shadow moving within a shadow in a space of nothingness where I was certain I had seen movement. I could not have been spotted, so I was not fearful. But if it was a mass of men moving so quietly that they made no sound, then I could be certain that they did not wish to be seen either. They were not hunters, therefore, but the hunted, moving with the care and stealth of a single wary animal. I should have turned right away. I should have turned away right then. I had no part in their business, but I pushed myself up gingerly and walked up toward where I had last sensed the shifting of the shadows. I strained my ears but heard nothing. And then a faint line of light appeared to my left, a door with a torch behind it, I sensed. I moved toward it and was able to hear low voices. Whoever was in there, they were clearly well rehearsed at this. I could not bring myself to resist the pull. I had to follow them. And then that single line of light disappeared. They were surely about to come out. I could not let my panicked breath be the only sound in the night, so I choked it off in my throat and started to walk away fast. But no one came out of the door, and so I paused before I reached the corner. I turned back. If their lights were darkened but they were not coming out, they must have gone somewhere else. Quickly, I returned, pulled the door open, and stepped in. My heart pounded in my ears, and I was alert for the slightest sound. In the profound darkness, my eyes were able to see a faint glow coming from in front of me. The torches had not been put out after all. I followed the light made by the men, who were by then less concerned about keeping quiet. I could sense that we were in a tunnel and that we were moving downhill. The light from ahead reflected back to me, and I could see other tunnels branching off frequently into the shadows on both sides of me. I was comfortable following the group, and we were moving along steadily when things turned brighter and got louder. I guessed that a group coming in our direction had encountered the men I was following. Just ahead of me, I could see the dark of a tunnel off to the side. It meant moving closer to where the men were gathered, but they were surely distracted by each other. I slipped in and went about 20 strides to the end of it, and from there, the light of the group was barely visible. I felt safe. I could hear their greeting and the oaths of loyalty to Eliadzur. It explained why they moved outside with such stealth. Someone issued the command to carry on, and there was much groaning and the sounds of heavy lifting. I would have to wait until the incoming group passed my nook to be able to slip out and carry on after the ones I was following. As the group coming towards me passed the opening of my nook, I could see that they were carrying a crate with many handles. One of them must have lost his grasp because the box dropped to the rocky floor loudly, followed by much cursing. I lowered myself to the ground and rolled onto my side. I faced the opening of my nook and curled my body to make myself small. "Easy going, men," shouted a gruff voice. "It's not like we're carrying glassware. Now let's try it again." There was a pause, some muttering, and then a good deal of laughter. "I just need a piss," said one of the men. At the sight of someone coming down the tunnel toward me, I held my breath and turned my face downwards, hoping it might make me harder to see. The person stumbled along a little, and I realized that his eyes would be less accustomed to the dark because of the torches. He came to a halt just 2 steps from me. How quickly would his eyes become accustomed to the dark? If he saw me and thought I was a person, he did nothing. Or perhaps he thought I was litter or stone debris. I hoped he would not come in for a closer look. The sound of urinating stopped, but he did not leave. I fought the urge to look up, worried my face might reflect light from the torches. Finally, he was pulled away by a frustrated shout from his commander and a joke about Onan's sin. After the men lifted their load and carried on, I moved quickly down the tunnel in pursuit of those I had been following. Because there were others in the tunnel now, I knew that any sound I might make would not be cause for alarm. I was gaining ground on the men, confidently watching the light ahead of me becoming stronger. And then it went out. Of course, the tunnel had to end, but I had not considered what I would do when it did. I slowed my walk, but at the same time I was certain that the men would not delay there. I listened for noises. There were none, and no light either. Then I felt the hair on the top of my head move and smelled fresh air. Only then did I realize I had emerged fully from the tunnel. I had walked under the neighborhood called Besedtha, north of the temple between the Antonia fortress and the third wall. Jerusalem was little more than a shadow looming into the dark, moonless night behind me.
Okay, I might be biased because these are from the time period I'm always immersed in, but I was on the edge of my seat for all of this, and I am when well I already have read the book that James read from, but I would read any of these others in a heartbeat. Thank you so much, everyone. We have just a few minutes left for conversation, so I'll just open it up to, I'm sure you may have questions or comments for each other, and I'll just keep an eye on the chat because guests could put questions in the little Q&A box. We have about 10 minutes for questions and conversation.
Can I just make a quick comment that's in terms of space aliens, there was some back and forth about space aliens and the story. Um, I thought don't forget the life of Brian, by the way. There definitely are space aliens that swoop in during the life of Brian. Anyway, just wanted to say that. And James, we were something about what you said about what would it like the anyway, I think you'd really enjoy reading the rest of Zeb's novel, which I just finished and I really, really enjoyed. But some of the stuff that you raised when you were talking, I think, is illustrated in some ways in part of Zeb's novel. So there you are.
Yeah, no, I'm planning on reading a lot more of your fiction. Prior to this being organized, I was not aware of at least some of it, and so yeah, yeah. I'm kind of sorry that I didn't seize the opportunity to share something that I'm working on and get the chance to get feedback on that as well, because I think everybody's got me hoping that you find a home for those novels, and that yeah, if not, you've find some way to circulate them because there will be a readership.
That's
And
an
George,
important point about the readership. Um, it is worth thinking about who does read this kind of thing that we write. Um, and I mentioned before faith fiction. There is an audience out there, and The Chosen, for example, the television series has totally hit that audience of the faithful, really, who want to see someone exploring in a very Christian way the story of the past, of the Bible stories. And it's sort of um it's difficult when you want to write for a more general audience. So for my interest is actually in trying to communicate the stories that we know very well to an audience that thinks they might not be interested in Jesus or the early church. The sort of people that might read, I don't know, Game of Thrones or anything, the sci-fi or historical novels about Jane Austen or the Elizabethans, or there's a whole lot of people that read historical fiction, but really wouldn't be interested in religious historical fiction because they think it's all just going to be faith fiction stuff. Um, and then what happens is sometimes people who are already well-known writers go, "Oh, I'm just going to write a story about Jesus," and they dip into it. And that can sit quite badly in terms of us. We can all read these things. I won't name any, where they have gone into the life of Jesus or Mary. And it's a beautiful novel. It's a beautiful novel. But actually, there's all sorts of things that don't sit well for us because we've gone into the history and we're going, oh no, they wouldn't have drunk that wine, or they wouldn't have done that, or that's completely out of sync with the way people thought in the time. But they can be very influential because they are already well-known creative writers. Um, yeah, I don't know where our work sits in terms of publishers and readership.
One of the things I've done a fair bit of reading about because it's so troubled me is the question of historical accuracy in historical fiction. Um, and I think that we learn something valuable from those kinds of books that you're talking about, Joan, because what we realize is what a lot of people are saying, the story matters more than the historical details or accuracy. And so there are some things that you can't do, but there is a whole lot you can do in the service of the story, in terms of departing from the historical or from the archaeological record. Um, and uh, and so, for example, in my story, I really wanted the city where the family eventually settles, in the Galilee, to be a pottery making city. But the city that I wanted, the village I wanted them in, had to be in the south. And there wasn't one. And so I took all of the qualities and features of a village that we know was a pottery making hub, and I applied them to this village that we know was not. Um, but that's because the story demands that this be a pottery making hub. And so that can be quite liberating. Yes, we need to do the research. Yes, we need to know the world, but we can also change things because we're allowed to as fiction writers. And now how far we go is a question nobody knows how to answer. But we are allowed to venture down that stream because we are fictionalizing. And that can be, as I said, that can be liberating.
I also am not going to mention any names, but I would say that that is far more accurate than actual historians who write about Jesus and Paul as though they're Episcopalians.
Wait, what? They weren't?
So far, there haven't been any questions in the chat. So, um,
Joan, I loved the way that you, not only that you wrote, but also the way you read. And the fact that the section you read was almost entirely dialogue. And so I wanted to just ask, is that a characteristic of the entire piece or more of the section that you read?
That's the section that I read. When I go into the rest of the historical novel, it sets scenes. It's a normal way of writing. So I describe things, and I third person, go in. But I just thought I'd be really spare in that first prelude because I didn't really need anything else other than to indicate that it was Pergamum, and whatever people imagined about ancient Pergamum, that would be fine for it. Um, I've been many years ago. I read Per Lagerkvist's novel Barabbas, and I don't know if you know that one. There is a great writer, amazing novelist who dipped into um, the world of Jesus and wrote this extraordinary novel, Barabbas. And that is very, very spare. And that was characteristic of Per Lagerkvist's writing. And it did make me realize how less is more often in our writing. And that's the challenge I have certainly is to pare things down and not get too wordy, just cut to the character. Um, but yes, I agree with Sarah in terms of what Zeb said. You're allowed to play all sorts of things in terms of how we create fiction. We're playing all the times. We're inventing things, but we don't want tomatoes on our table. Do you know what I mean? And um, if you are doing something about the pottery, I'm sure you will have researched exactly how people did pottery at that time. You wouldn't have them an anachronistic kiln, for example. And so we're allowed to do all sorts of things in terms of moving things around in our world. But what our world has to be is the world of its time and not a world from a different time that's all sort of mashed together, or yeah, indeed, people thinking thoughts that they wouldn't really have been capable of thinking. And that's quite difficult to navigate, to really situate our characters authentically in the time. Um, So yes, it is a challenge, and we change. Also, the more we learn, the more we're aware of what was appropriate for the time will change.
Thank you. And I see that our time is actually up, but isn't that the same problem we face as historians not writing fiction? Trying not to bring things to that world that are from our world and don't belong there. And it's a constant, that is the whole work in both realms. Um, so I believe that the St. Effects tech folks need to turn off the webinar now, but I'll just ask the panelists to stay for a few minutes afterwards. And on behalf of St. Effects and everyone who was watching, thank you all so much. This was very enjoyable. It was wonderful.
Thank you.